If that turbine reaches 63%, your entire system is going to tear itself apart. The sentence stopped 3 engineers mid-step. Audrey Whitmore looked up from the glass conference table with the kind of controlled irritation that made people around her instantly quiet. The prototype turbine stood 30 feet away behind a wall of reinforced glass, silver blades turning slowly beneath white showroom lights, while investors from Chicago and Washington gathered along the observation deck above. In less than 7 minutes, Helix Dynamics would begin the largest demonstration in company history. A $200 million defense contract streamed live to military buyers across the country. Audrey had spent 3 years building toward this morning. Nothing was supposed to go wrong. Then she saw the red markings across her blueprint. Sharp handwriting, mechanical annotations, stress points circled in red ink, 3 equations corrected in the margins, and at the bottom of the page, 1 signature. "C. Mercer." "Who touched this?" she asked quietly. Nobody answered immediately. The room shifted with nervous energy. Then one of the junior designers pointed toward the far side of the studio floor. It was the janitor. Audrey turned. Caleb Mercer stood near the maintenance cart beside the rear wall, one hand still holding a folded cleaning rag. He looked completely out of place inside the polished engineering studio. Gray maintenance uniform, worn work boots, faint shadows under his eyes like a man who had not slept enough in years. Early 40s maybe. Quiet. Forgettable. The kind of man executives passed every day without ever really seeing. 2 security guards already stood beside him. Audrey walked toward him slowly, disbelief tightening across her face. "You wrote on my design?" Caleb met her eyes without flinching. "I corrected the harmonic load calculation." A few people laughed immediately. One engineer muttered, "Oh my God." Another shook his head and pulled out his phone like the moment itself was entertainment. Audrey stopped 3 feet from Caleb. "You corrected it?" "Yes." "You're a janitor." "That doesn't change the math." The room went silent. For half a second before nervous laughter spread again. Audrey stared at the blueprint in her hand. Red marks covered the central pressure routing model for the AI turbine core, the same design her company planned to unveil to the investors upstairs. She had personally approved every line herself. Nobody touched Audrey Whitmore's work. Nobody. "Do you understand what this room is?" she asked coldly. Caleb glanced once toward the turbine behind the glass. A room full of people about to overload a compression system. One of the senior engineers scoffed loudly. "This guy watches 2 YouTube videos, and suddenly he's Nikola Tesla." More laughter. Audrey did not smile. She was too angry for that now. Months of pressure. Investors breathing down her neck. Competitors waiting for her to fail. And now some maintenance worker had the arrogance to scribble across the most important blueprint in the building minutes before launch. "Security," she said calmly. "Escort him out." Caleb did not move. "If you start the turbine above 62% load, the 3rd stage housing will destabilize." Audrey folded the blueprint sharply. "You are finished here." One guard reached for Caleb's badge. He handed it over without resistance. No argument. No pleading. That almost irritated Audrey more. People usually defended themselves when their careers were ending. Caleb simply nodded once and set the cleaning rag onto the cart. As he turned toward the exit, his eyes drifted briefly toward the turbine again, not emotional, not angry, just focused in a way Audrey could not immediately explain. Then he spoke one final sentence without looking back. "When the vibration starts, shut valve 3 first." The doors closed behind him. Upstairs, the investors began applauding as the presentation countdown appeared across the massive digital wall. The doors to the engineering studio sealed shut behind Caleb Mercer with a soft hydraulic click, and almost immediately the room relaxed into laughter again. One of the younger engineers leaned back against the conference table and shook his head. "I still cannot believe the janitor tried correcting Audrey Whitmore's math 5 minutes before launch." Another picked up the blueprint Caleb had marked in red and held it up like evidence from a comedy sketch. "Look at this." He circled the pressure transfer ratios. "No," someone else added, grinning. "My favorite part was shut valve 3 first." A few people laughed harder at that. Audrey did not join them. She stood near the glass wall overlooking the turbine chamber with her arms folded tightly across her chest while the countdown clock above the presentation stage rolled under 4 minutes. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass. Calm posture, controlled breathing, perfect image. Inside, pressure tightened harder every second. She hated disruptions. She hated unpredictability even more. And somehow that quiet maintenance worker had managed to inject both into the single most important morning of her career. Dominic Hale, her lead systems engineer, stepped beside her holding a tablet loaded with diagnostic data. "Everything is stable," he said carefully. "We are ready." Audrey nodded once. "Good." But her eyes drifted back toward the blueprint still lying open on the conference table. Red circles. Tiny handwritten equations. Caleb's corrections were annoyingly precise. Not random scribbles. Not guesses. Actual engineering notation. Dominic noticed where she was looking. "You are not seriously thinking about what he said." Audrey turned sharply. "Of course not. Because the harmonic calculations were verified 8 times. I know that. And the turbine passed every simulation. I know that too." Dominic hesitated. "Then why are you still looking at the blueprint?" Audrey did not answer immediately. She hated that question because she already knew the answer herself. The janitor had not sounded uncertain. That was the problem. Arrogant people usually over-explain themselves. Caleb Mercer had not argued, had not panicked, had not tried to save his job. He had simply looked at the turbine once and spoken like a man warning someone about rain he already knew was coming. Upstairs, applause echoed from the investor balcony as waiters moved through the crowd with champagne glasses balanced on silver trays. The livestream countdown now displayed across every monitor in the building. 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Dominic tapped his tablet again. Pressure systems are green. Cooling system stable. Rotational balance nominal. Audrey finally forced herself to step away from the blueprint. "Then we proceed." Across the studio floor, a junior engineer named Marcus folded Caleb's marked copy in half and tossed it into a recycling bin near the wall. "Problem solved," he joked. More laughter. Audrey walked toward the presentation chamber without reacting. The turbine stood in the center of the room beneath white lights, sleek and silent like something built for the future. Investors lined the upper glass balcony above. Defense consultants, government buyers, corporate media. Every eye in the building now pointed toward Helix Dynamics. Audrey stepped onto the presentation platform as cameras turned toward her. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began smoothly, "today you are about to witness the next generation of adaptive turbine intelligence." Applause followed immediately. Behind the glass enclosure, the system operators activated the startup sequence. Deep inside the chamber, the turbine blades began turning faster. 20%, 35%, 48%. The room vibrated faintly beneath the polished floor. Audrey continued speaking while giant digital displays projected performance metrics behind her. "This system reduces energy loss by nearly 40% while increasing adaptive load response under extreme conditions. 57%, 60%. Dominic watched the readings carefully from the control station. Everything still looked perfect. Then the turbine emitted a sound so faint most people missed it completely. A small metallic tremor buried beneath the normal rotation hum. Audrey stopped speaking for half a second. Dominic frowned at his monitor. 62%. Somewhere in the back of Audrey's mind, she heard Caleb Mercer's voice again. "Do not start at above 62% load." The metallic tremor came again at 62% load, louder this time. Sharp enough that several engineers near the control station looked up from their monitors at the exact same moment. Dominic Hale frowned and tapped the screen in front of him twice. "I am seeing a fluctuation in Chamber 3. Audrey kept her expression neutral as cameras continued broadcasting her presentation across the giant screens above the investors. "Compensate for it," she said quietly without turning her head. "Already trying." The turbine accelerated again. 63%. The vibration spread through the floor beneath Audrey's heels like a low earthquake trapped under steel. A glass of champagne near the investor balcony trembled hard enough to ripple over the edge. The room changed instantly. Engineers who had been relaxed 30 seconds earlier now stared at the monitors with rigid shoulders and tightened jaws. One technician leaned toward Dominic. "The thermal variance is climbing too fast." "That is impossible," Dominic snapped. "The cooling cycle should be balancing automatically." But the numbers on the screen continued climbing anyway. Inside the glass chamber, the turbine blades spun faster, silver edges blurring beneath the white lights. Then came a second sound. Not loud. Worse than loud. A deep, uneven, grinding noise buried beneath the rotational hum. The kind of sound experienced engineers recognized immediately and never forgot. Audrey stopped speaking mid-sentence. Above her, the applause from the investors faded into confused silence. Dominic's face lost color. Pressure imbalance, he whispered. One of the junior engineers looked toward the recycling bin near the wall where Caleb's marked blueprint had been thrown away less than 5 minutes earlier. Suddenly nobody in the room was laughing anymore. Audrey stepped off the presentation platform and moved quickly toward the control station. Talk to me. Dominic pulled up the internal diagnostics. Third stage housing is overheating. By how much? 17% above expected tolerance. Audrey felt a cold sensation move through her chest. That is not possible. I know. Another engineer rushed toward them holding the folded blueprint recovered from the bin. Red circles covered the exact section, now flashing warning indicators on every screen in the room. Someone unfolded the page. Completely across the table. Silence spread through the engineering floor. Caleb Mercer had marked the stress fracture location perfectly. Not approximately. Perfectly. One senior engineer slowly removed his glasses and stared at the blueprint. How did he even see this? Nobody answered him. The vibration beneath the floor intensified. Overhead lights flickered once. Investors along the balcony exchanged nervous looks while cameras quietly shifted away from the turbine chamber. Audrey grabbed the blueprint from the table herself and scanned the red notes again. Tiny equations. Revised pressure ratios. Handwritten warnings. Every correction aligned exactly with the live failures now appearing across the system diagnostics. Dominic swallowed hard. Audrey, what? There is more. He enlarged the thermal model on the monitor. A bright red stress line spread through the center housing assembly like a crack moving beneath ice. Audrey stared at it in disbelief. No, if the resonance keeps building at this rate, the turbine will automatically shut itself down. How long? Dominic looked at the estimate clock. Maybe 4 minutes. Above them, investors had stopped talking entirely now. The room felt smaller with every passing second. One engineer looked toward Audrey carefully before speaking. Who exactly was that guy? Nobody laughed this time. Audrey looked back toward the glass exit doors Caleb Mercer had walked through earlier. For the first time that morning, the certainty in her expression disappeared completely. Then one of the oldest engineers in the company slowly leaned forward toward the blueprint and narrowed his eyes at the signature written at the bottom of the page. See, Mercer. His face changed instantly. Wait, he said quietly. That name. Dominic turned toward him. What about it? The older engineer looked back up slowly, almost unsettled by his own realization. Caleb Mercer worked on adaptive turbine harmonics 15 years ago. Audrey frowned. That is impossible. The man did not look away from the signature. No, he said carefully. What is impossible is that your janitor somehow writes exactly like the engineer who invented this stabilization model in the first place. The turbine chamber emitted another uneven vibration that rolled through the building hard enough to rattle the glass walls surrounding the investor balcony. Several executives stepped backward instinctively, while security personnel exchanged uneasy looks near the exits. On the main display monitors, warning indicators multiplied across the diagnostics screen faster than the engineers could clear them. Dominic Hale stared at the thermal readings in disbelief. The pressure imbalance is accelerating. Audrey Whitmore turned sharply toward him. Shut it down. I already tried. What do you mean you tried? Dominic swallowed once before answering. The automated sequence is not responding. That sentence changed the room completely. Engineers who had spent the last 10 minutes trying to preserve their composure now moved with open panic beneath the polished calm of corporate professionalism. One technician rushed toward the rear terminal station. Another pulled up emergency override protocols on a secondary monitor. The investors above them had stopped pretending this was a normal demonstration. Nobody was drinking champagne anymore. Audrey looked back at the blueprint in her hand. Caleb's red notes suddenly felt heavier than paper. Shut valve 3 first. The sentence replayed inside her head with painful clarity now. One of the younger engineers looked toward Dominic. Should we isolate chamber 3 manually? Dominic hesitated too long before answering. Audrey noticed immediately. Why are you hesitating? Dominic looked at the pressure map again. Because if Mercer was right about the harmonic instability, he stopped himself. Audrey stepped closer. Say it. Then the vibration is not originating from chamber 3. Silence spread across the engineering floor. Dominic enlarged the live turbine schematic on the central display. A glowing stress fracture pattern spread beneath the housing assembly exactly where Caleb had circled the blueprint earlier. One senior technician whispered under his breath, almost to himself. My God. Audrey stared at the display without blinking. Every red mark Caleb had written now, aligned perfectly with the system failure in real time. Not one correction had been wrong. Not one. Above them, the investors began quietly moving away from the observation glass. The confidence inside the room was gone now. All that remained was the growing realization that the maintenance worker they had laughed at had understood the system better than the entire engineering division combined. The older engineer who recognized Caleb's name stepped closer to Audrey carefully. You said his name was Caleb Mercer? Audrey nodded once. Why? The engineer removed his glasses slowly. Because 15 years ago there was a lead adaptive systems architect named Charles Mercer. Dominic looked over immediately. The Mercer stabilization papers? Yes. Those are classified military designs. The older engineer nodded again. Exactly. Audrey frowned. What does that have to do with our janitor? The engineer looked directly at the blueprint in her hands. Charles Mercer disappeared from the industry after his wife died. Nobody spoke after that. Audrey's eyes shifted back toward the glass doors Caleb had exited through earlier that morning. She suddenly remembered how calm he had been. No fear. No desperation. Just certainty. Dominic interrupted the silence quietly. Audrey, what? You need to see this. He pulled security records onto the main monitor. Employment file. Caleb Mercer. Position, overnight maintenance staff. Start date, 11 months earlier. Audrey skimmed the file impatiently until her eyes stopped on one line near the bottom. Former occupation, withheld due to non-disclosure agreements. Dominic zoomed further into the archived employment verification attached beneath the file. The room went completely silent. Helios Defense Systems. Senior Adaptive Turbine Architect. Audrey stared at the screen without moving. One of the younger engineers actually laughed once in disbelief before stopping himself immediately. That is not real. Dominic kept reading. 14 patents in rotational harmonic stabilization. Lead consultant on military propulsion systems. National Engineering Medal nominee. Nobody looked away from the monitor now. The janitor they had escorted out of the building had designed systems more advanced than the prototype currently collapsing in front of them. Then the turbine chamber suddenly emitted a sharp metallic screech that cut through the room hard enough to make several people jump. Red emergency lights flashed across the walls instantly. Dominic looked at the pressure readings and went pale. The housing assembly is beginning to fail. Audrey turned toward him immediately. How long? Dominic answered without taking his eyes off the monitor. Maybe 3 minutes. Then, after one more glance at Caleb's red warning notes, he added quietly, unless Mercer shuts it down first. Audrey Whitmore grabbed her phone and walked away from the engineering floor fast enough that 2 assistants had to step aside to avoid colliding with her. Behind her, the turbine chamber continued emitting uneven metallic vibrations that rolled through the building every few seconds like distant thunder trapped inside steel walls. Investors were already whispering among themselves on the upper balcony. Several had stopped watching the presentation entirely and were now watching the engineers instead. Audrey hated that more than the system failure itself. Panic inside a room spread faster than fire. Dominic Hale caught up beside her near the elevator lobby. Security says Mercer already left the building. Audrey pressed the elevator button repeatedly. Then find him. We are trying. Trying is not good enough. Dominic lowered his voice carefully. Audrey, there is something else. She turned sharply. What now? The board members upstairs know the prototype is unstable. Of course they do. No. I mean they know Mercer warned us before the launch. Audrey stared at him for one long second. Who told them? Dominic hesitated. That hesitation answered the question by itself. Someone in the engineering room had already leaked the story upstairs. The janitor had predicted the failure before the company's entire engineering division noticed it themselves. Audrey closed her eyes briefly. The timing could not have been worse. Investors did not lose confidence because systems failed. Systems failed everywhere. Investors lost confidence when leadership looked blind. The elevator doors opened. Audrey stepped inside with Dominic and two senior engineers following behind her. One of them still held Caleb's marked blueprint in both hands like evidence from a crime scene nobody understood yet. As the elevator descended toward the parking garage, Dominic quietly opened Caleb Mercer's archived employment history again on the tablet. There is almost nothing after Helios Defense Systems. Audrey looked over. What do you mean nothing? I mean nothing. Dominic scrolled through the records. No engineering jobs. No consulting contracts. No conference appearances. No patents filed after 8 years ago. One engineer frowned. A guy like this does not just disappear. Dominic nodded once. Exactly. The elevator doors opened into the underground garage. Audrey moved quickly toward her car, while Dominic continued reading from the file behind her. Married at 31. Wife died from cancer 2 years later. Audrey slowed slightly without realizing it. Dominic continued. After that, Mercer withdrew from every active defense contract within 6 months. One of the engineers looked genuinely confused now. Then why is he cleaning office floors? Nobody answered him. Audrey stopped beside her black sedan and looked toward the rain-covered exit ramp leading out into the city. For the first time all morning, she realized she had never once actually looked at Caleb Mercer like a person. She had seen a uniform, a maintenance badge, a janitor touching her work. That was all. Meanwhile, the man had stood in front of a collapsing turbine system he practically invented and warned her anyway. Her phone vibrated suddenly. Dominic answered before she could. The color drained from his face almost immediately. Audrey. What? The vibration spread just triggered a containment shutdown. Audrey froze. Tell me the chamber is secure. It is secure for now. For now. Dominic looked at the latest diagnostics. The system is still building pressure internally. Audrey looked back toward the elevator. 20 floors above them sat the largest investors her company had ever brought together. Cameras, government contracts, media coverage, and a prototype now minutes away from complete operational collapse. Dominic spoke carefully. If Mercer is the only person who fully understands the harmonic structure, Audrey cut him off immediately. Then we bring him back. Rain hammered against the garage entrance as Audrey got into the driver's seat herself instead of waiting for a driver. Dominic stared at her in surprise. You are going personally? Audrey started the engine. I fired him personally. She pulled the sedan out into the wet Chicago streets while downtown traffic reflected silver and red through the rain-covered windshield. For several seconds, nobody inside the car spoke. Then one of the engineers quietly looked down at the little red equations still covering the blueprint and whispered almost to himself. He tried to save us anyway. Audrey tightened both hands on the steering wheel, but said nothing. Because for the first time since this morning began, she was starting to understand something far worse than the failing turbine. Caleb Mercer had never needed helix dynamics at all. Rain swept across downtown Chicago in heavy silver sheets, while Audrey Whitmore drove through traffic faster than she normally would have allowed anyone else to. The windshield wipers moved continuously, barely keeping the road visible beneath the storm. Beside her, Dominic Hale refreshed Caleb Mercer's employment records over and over like he still expected them to suddenly make less sense. They never did. Every new detail only made the silence inside the car heavier. I found another patent, Dominic said quietly. Audrey kept her eyes on the road. What kind? Adaptive harmonic compensation under military load conditions. One of the engineers in the back seat leaned forward immediately. That was the foundation for the entire helix turbine architecture. Dominic nodded once. Yes. The engineer looked stunned. Then our system is basically built on his work. Nobody answered because the answer had already become obvious. Audrey tightened her grip on the steering wheel slightly. Her company had spent 3 years presenting the turbine project as revolutionary. Engineering. Investors called it groundbreaking. Defense analysts called it the future. Meanwhile, the man who helped invent the underlying stabilization model had been emptying office trash cans in the same building for nearly a year while employees laughed at him. The realization made her chest feel strangely tight. Dominic looked out the passenger window toward a quieter neighborhood several miles away from downtown. Security tracked his employee parking registration. Audrey turned left at the next intersection. Where? Westbrook District. Small residential area near Lincoln Elementary. Rainwater splashed beneath the tires as the sedan moved through narrower streets lined with old brick apartment buildings and neighborhood diners glowing softly behind fogged windows. The city looked different here. Smaller, slower, nothing like the polished glass towers surrounding Helix Dynamics. Audrey finally pulled alongside a modest community center with a faded sign near the entrance reading Westbrook's Science Fair tonight. Children's drawings covered the front windows. Dominic looked confused. This is where his badge pinged last. Audrey stared through the rain-covered windshield. Inside the building, children moved between folding tables covered in cardboard projects and homemade robots. Parents stood nearby holding paper coffee cups while fluorescent lights reflected softly across the gymnasium floor. Then Audrey saw him. Caleb Mercer stood near the far side of the room beside a small table covered in wires, batteries, and pieces of painted cardboard. Sophie sat beside him wearing oversized safety goggles while two younger children watched excitedly. Caleb adjusted something inside a tiny handmade robot no taller than 12 inches. The machine rolled forward across the table, blinking uneven blue lights while the children burst into applause. Audrey did not move for several seconds. The contrast almost felt unreal. 40 minutes earlier, the man had stood inside a collapsing multi-million-dollar engineering crisis while senior executives mocked him. Now he stood calmly inside a neighborhood school gym helping children build science projects out of recycled parts. Dominic spoke quietly beside her. He brought the same focus to this. Audrey noticed he was right immediately. Caleb moved with the same precise calm he had shown around the turbine. Careful hands. Quiet concentration. No wasted motion. Sophie looked up at her father with complete confidence, the kind children only had when they believed their parent could fix anything in the world. Audrey suddenly remembered something from the personnel file. Widower. Single father. Overnight shifts requested specifically for childcare scheduling. One of the engineers in the back seat lowered his voice. He was cleaning our floors at night, so he could be here with his daughter during the day. Nobody inside the car spoke after that. Through the rain-covered windows, Audrey watched Caleb kneel beside Sophie while helping her reconnect a loose wire inside the little robot. Sophie smiled the moment the machine moved again. Caleb smiled too, small and tired but genuine. It was the first time Audrey had seen any expression on his face that was not controlled restraint. Then Caleb looked toward the parking lot. Not surprised, not alarmed, just aware. Their eyes met through the rain-streaked windshield from nearly 50 feet away. Audrey felt something uncomfortable settle in her stomach immediately because she realized he already knew why she had come. Audrey Whitmore stepped out of the sedan into the cold rain while water splashed against the pavement around her heels. Across the parking lot, Caleb Mercer remained beside the small science fair table, helping Sophie tighten a tiny screw inside the cardboard robot. He did not look surprised to see her. That bothered Audrey more than anger would have. Most people reacted when the chief executive officer who had fired them showed up in person less than an hour later. Caleb simply looked at her once and returned his attention to the robot, like he already understood exactly how the evening was going to unfold. Inside the gymnasium, children moved between folding tables covered with homemade volcanoes, model bridges, and small science projects held together with tape and glue. The smell of pizza and paper cups of coffee filled the air. It was warm, simple, human, nothing like Helix Dynamics. Audrey suddenly felt overdressed standing there in a charcoal designer coat that probably cost more than every project in the room combined. Sophie looked up first. "Daddy," she said softly, "that is the lady from your building." Caleb nodded once without looking away from the robot. "I know." Audrey walked closer slowly while Dominic and the two engineers remained near the entrance behind her. Nobody inside the gym recognized her. That almost felt strange after years of living inside rooms where every face reacted the moment she entered. Here she was simply another adult standing beside folding tables under fluorescent lights. Caleb finally straightened and looked at her directly. "How bad is it?" Audrey hesitated. The question landed harder than she expected because he already knew there was no scenario where she would come personally unless the situation was serious. "The turbine is destabilizing," she admitted. Caleb nodded once like the answer confirmed something he expected. "Did you shut valve 3? Audrey glanced at Dominic briefly. Dominic answered for her. "We isolated chamber 3 instead." Caleb closed his eyes for half a second. Not dramatic, just tired. Then the resonance already spread into the housing assembly. One of the engineers behind Audrey spoke quickly. How did you know that? Caleb looked toward him calmly. Because the imbalance was never in Chamber 3. Silence followed immediately. Even inside a school gym filled with children talking and chairs scraping against polished floors, the tension around their group suddenly felt heavy. Audrey lowered her voice. Can you fix it? Caleb looked past her toward the rain-covered parking lot windows, as if mentally calculating the system in real time from memory alone. Maybe. That single word carried more honesty than every polished corporate reassurance Audrey had heard all week. Sophie tugged lightly on Caleb's sleeve. Daddy, is your work broken again? Caleb looked down at her immediately, and his entire expression softened in a way Audrey had never seen before. A little. Sophie frowned thoughtfully at the cardboard robot on the table. Did they not listen? Dominic looked away instantly. Audrey felt heat rise uncomfortably into her face because a 7-year-old girl had just summarized the entire disaster more accurately than the executive board upstairs. Caleb crouched beside Sophie and adjusted the crooked safety goggles slipping down her nose. Can you stay with Mrs. Reynolds for a little while longer? Sophie looked toward Audrey carefully before nodding once. Are you going to fix the loud machine? Caleb gave a small tired smile. I am going to try. Sophie wrapped both arms around his neck briefly before running toward one of the teachers supervising the event. Audrey watched the interaction silently. There was no performance in it. No image management. No ambition. Just a father trying to keep promises in a world that kept demanding more from him. Caleb stood again and picked up his old gray jacket from the back of the folding chair. One engineer looked at him carefully. Why were you working as a janitor? Caleb slipped one arm into the jacket before answering. Night shifts paid enough and let me be home during the day. The engineer opened his mouth slightly like he wanted to ask something else, but stopped himself. Because suddenly nobody there felt comfortable questioning the man anymore. Audrey looked directly at Caleb. If you come back with us, Helix will make this right. Caleb met her eyes calmly. Your company is not the thing I was worried about tonight. Then he walked past her toward the exit while rain hammered against the glass doors outside, and every person from Helix Dynamics instinctively stepped aside to let the janitor lead the way. The ride back to Helix Dynamics was completely silent except for rain striking the roof of the sedan and the distant vibration of Audrey Whitmore's phone every few seconds with new alerts from the engineering floor. Caleb Mercer sat in the back seat beside the folded blueprint, looking out through the rain-covered window while downtown Chicago lights blurred silver and gold across the glass. Nobody tried making conversation anymore. The atmosphere inside the car had changed too much for that. Dominic Hale glanced at Caleb twice, like he still could not fully process the situation. 8 hours earlier, the man had been cleaning conference room floors while employees walked past him without learning his name. Now every engineer inside Helix Dynamics was waiting for him to save the company. Audrey finally broke the silence quietly. Why did you not say who you were? Caleb kept watching the city outside. Would it have changed anything this morning? Audrey opened her mouth slightly, then stopped. Because she already knew the answer. No, she still would have seen a maintenance uniform first. She still would have reacted to someone touching her design. The realization sat heavily in her chest now. Caleb looked toward the front windshield. People hear what they expect to hear. Dominic lowered his eyes toward the blueprint in his lap. Nobody argued with him. When the sedan finally pulled beneath the glass tower of Helix Dynamics, the atmosphere outside looked completely different from earlier that evening. Media vans lined part of the street. Additional security personnel stood near the entrances. Investors clustered in tense conversations beneath the lobby lights while employees moved quickly through the building carrying tablets and printed diagnostics reports. The moment Audrey stepped out of the car, several board members approached immediately. How bad is it? Are we contained? The investors want answers. Audrey did not stop walking. Later, then Caleb stepped out beside her. The entire group fell silent instantly. One older board member frowned in confusion. Who is that? Dominic answered before Audrey could. The man who designed half the stabilization architecture your company is built on. Nobody spoke after that. Inside the elevator, the atmosphere tightened again as the floors climbed rapidly toward the engineering division. Caleb remained calm, while everyone else watched the rising numbers above the doors with increasing tension. 23rd floor. 24th. 25th. The higher they went, the louder the distant vibration became beneath the structure itself. Audrey noticed Caleb listening to the sound more than looking at the monitors. His expression shifted, slightly at one particular metallic tremor. The resonance spread into the secondary housing already, he said quietly. Dominic looked up sharply. How can you tell? Caleb answered without emotion. The frequency changed. The elevator doors opened. The engineering floor looked nothing like it had an hour earlier. Gone were the confident presentations and polished smiles. Engineers crowded around diagnostic stations while warning lights reflected red across the glass walls. Investors stood farther back now, watching silently. The moment Caleb stepped onto the floor, conversations stopped one by one across the room until the entire engineering division fell quiet. Audrey noticed it immediately. Earlier they had laughed at him. Now nobody even seemed comfortable breathing too loudly near him. One of the younger engineers who had mocked Caleb earlier stepped aside from the main console without being asked. Caleb walked directly toward the turbine chamber without hurrying. He did not ask for reports, did not ask for updates. He simply stood near the reinforced glass wall and listened. The turbine emitted another deep, uneven vibration through the chamber. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. Then he opened them and looked toward Dominic, who isolated chamber 3. Dominic swallowed once. I did. Caleb nodded once. That trapped the pressure imbalance inside the secondary housing. Nobody in the room moved. Caleb stepped toward the central control station and looked across the diagnostics for less than 5 seconds. Open valve, 12%. One engineer blinked in confusion. Only 12. Caleb looked at him calmly. Do you want the housing to crack completely? Silence again. The engineer immediately turned back toward the controls. Audrey stood several feet away watching the entire room react to Caleb Mercer like gravity itself had shifted around him. Nobody questioned him anymore. Nobody laughed. Nobody interrupted. The janitor she had thrown out of the building now stood at the center of Helix Dynamics, while senior engineers waited for permission to touch their own system. The entire engineering floor stood silent while Caleb Mercer watched the live diagnostics scrolling across the central monitors. Red warning indicators still flashed through the turbine system, but the violent vibration beneath the building had begun to soften slightly after valve 3 opened 12%. Dominic Hale stared at the stabilizing pressure numbers almost like he did not trust his own screen anymore. The resonance is slowing, he said quietly. Caleb nodded once without looking away from the chamber. For now. One of the board members stepped forward nervously. Can the system still be saved? Caleb finally turned toward him. That depends. On what? Caleb looked back toward the turbine. Whether your engineers are willing to stop fighting the machine long enough to listen to it. Nobody spoke after that. The room had reached the strange point where every sentence from him seemed less like conversation and more like instruction. Caleb stepped closer to the control station and placed one hand lightly against the metal surface beneath the monitor screens. He stayed there for several seconds without moving. One young engineer whispered under his breath, "What is he doing?" Dominic answered quietly without taking his eyes off Caleb. Listening. Another uneven vibration rolled through the chamber. Caleb opened his eyes immediately. There. He pointed toward the pressure map. The imbalance is bouncing between the secondary housing and the coolant bypass. Dominic enlarged the section instantly. A sharp spike appeared exactly where Caleb indicated less than 2 seconds later. Several engineers stared at him openly now. One older systems analyst actually removed his headset slowly and shook his head once in disbelief. Caleb moved toward the main override controls. Reduce rotational load to 58%. Done. Now reopen the coolant bypass manually. Manual override is locked. Caleb looked toward the engineer who said it. Then unlock it. The board restricted direct manual access after the Denver incident. Caleb held the engineer's stare for one quiet second. And how is that policy working out for you tonight? Nobody laughed. The engineer immediately entered the override authorization code. Audrey Whitmore watched everything from several feet away without interrupting once. Earlier that morning, she had defended every detail of the system like it was personal territory. Now she realized something uncomfortable. Caleb Mercer did not interact with the turbine like a manager protecting a project. He interacted with it like a man who understood it deeply enough to hear when it was hurting. The coolant bypass reopened manually. The turbine emitted one sharp metallic groan through the chamber before the vibration suddenly dropped almost completely. Every engineer in the room froze. Dominic stared at the diagnostic screen. Thermal pressure was falling. Rotational balance stabilizing. Warning indicators disappearing one by one. The room remained silent for 3 full seconds before someone finally whispered, "It is working." Another engineer checked the numbers again in disbelief. "No, it is actually stabilizing." Above the engineering floor, investors who had been preparing quiet exit strategies now moved back toward the observation glass. Audrey watched their posture change in real time, fear turning cautiously back into confidence. But nobody downstairs cared about the investors anymore. Every eye in the room remained fixed on Caleb Mercer. He stood at the controls calmly while the system continued stabilizing around him like the turbine itself recognized its creator had returned. Dominic looked at the live data and slowly exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. Pressure normalized. One of the younger engineers leaned back against the console in complete disbelief. 27 senior engineers could not stop this. Caleb looked toward the chamber one last time before answering quietly. Because 27 engineers kept treating the symptoms instead of the structure. Silence again. Audrey stepped closer carefully. "You designed the original harmonic model, did not you?" Caleb met her eyes for the first time since returning to Helix Dynamics. "Most of it. Then why leave?" The question escaped before Audrey could stop herself. The room stayed completely still, waiting for the answer. Caleb looked briefly toward the rain-covered city lights beyond. The glass walls. "Because after my wife died," he said quietly, "I stopped caring whether the world knew my name." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the investors upstairs had fallen silent now. Then one of the board members slowly looked around the engineering floor and said the thing every person there was already realizing. "We almost threw out the only man in the building who actually understood the machine." Audrey looked toward Caleb again, but this time the feeling inside the room had changed completely. Earlier that day, they had seen a janitor standing beside a blueprint. Now, every person inside Helix Dynamics understood they had been standing beside the architect the entire time.